The morning began quietly, with the soft hum of the city waking up outside the windows. The sun had just started to rise, spreading a pale orange glow across the narrow streets. Inside the small apartment, a young man named Daniel tied his shoelaces and reached for his work bag. He glanced at the clock. It was 6:45 a.m., the same time he left every day for his shift at the warehouse. There was nothing unusual about the morning. The same lukewarm coffee, the same slightly wrinkled uniform, and the same quiet bus ride ahead. He didn't know this would be the day that would stay in his memory forever. He stepped out into the crisp air, pulling his jacket tighter. The streets were still calm, only a few early workers moving about. He liked this part of the day, the silence before the world got noisy. The bus arrived right on time, and he nodded at the driver, who gave a small wave. It was a routine that didn't need words. Daniel sat near the window, leaned his head against the glass, and watched the buildings pass by one after another. His eyes were tired, but there was a calm rhythm to it all. The warehouse stood at the edge of town, a long gray building that looked the same every day. Inside, the smell of cardboard and oil filled the air. Machines hummed in the distance. A few workers were already unloading boxes, their voices echoing through the large space. Daniel greeted a few familiar faces and headed to his section. He worked in packaging, stacking, sealing, and labeling boxes for shipment. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was steady, and the people made it bearable. He started his shift like always, putting on his gloves and setting the tape dispenser beside him. The radio played softly from a nearby shelf, old songs that everyone knew but no one really listened to. Across the aisle, one of his coworkers cracked a joke about the endless number of boxes, and everyone laughed lightly. It was the same kind of humor that got them through long hours. There was a comfort in the routine, a kind of rhythm that made time move faster. By 8 a.m., the warehouse was fully alive. The forklifts beeped as they moved pallets from one corner to another. The sound of tape ripping and cardboard folding filled the air. Daniel fell into his usual pace: cut, fold, tape, label, repeat. His hands moved automatically while his mind wandered. He thought about the small things waiting at home, the unfinished painting on his wall, the bills on the counter, the call he needed to make to his sister. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady. That's what he liked about it. During his first break, he sat on a wooden bench outside with a few others. The air smelled of coffee and diesel. They talked about the weather, how cold it had gotten lately, and how the new supervisor seemed stricter than the last one. Someone pulled out their phone to show a funny video, and laughter filled the air again. For a moment, everything felt light. There was no hint that anything unusual was waiting ahead. The sun had climbed higher, and the warehouse roof gleamed in the light. It looked like another normal day, ordinary, predictable, safe. When the break ended, Daniel went back to his station. He noticed one of the conveyor belts had stopped briefly, but a technician was already working on it. "It'll be fine in a few minutes," the man said, waving his hand casually. No one paid much attention. Small breakdowns happened all the time. Daniel took a sip of water and returned to packing boxes. He didn't realize he'd remember that small moment so clearly later. The slight buzz in the air, the technician's quick reassurance, the way everyone just carried on. By mid-morning, things were back to normal. The radio now played a cheerful song, and someone was humming along. Daniel worked quietly, lost in his thoughts. He liked observing small details, the way sunlight filtered through the high windows, the sound of sneakers squeaking on the floor, the smell of warm plastic when the machines ran too long. There was a strange comfort in the sameness of it all. Life didn't surprise him much anymore, and he had made peace with that. Around 11, he caught sight of a coworker helping a new trainee who looked nervous and out of place. It reminded Daniel of his own first week, how lost he'd felt among the loud machines and endless rules. He smiled at the memory. Back then, everything had seemed complicated, but over time it became second nature. Now he was one of the steady hands, the reliable ones others asked for help. He didn't see himself as special, just someone doing his part. He found quiet pride in that. The hours slipped by easily. At one point, Daniel thought about the weekend ahead. Maybe he'd visit his parents or meet an old friend for lunch. The idea made him smile. He was reaching for another stack of boxes when someone called out his name. It was his shift partner, asking for help with a heavy crate. He nodded and followed, his gloves brushing against the rough surface of the boxes. Together, they lifted and moved it to the loading zone. It was heavy but manageable. Just another small part of the day. By lunchtime, the warehouse quieted a little. People spread out across the cafeteria, chatting between bites of sandwiches and leftovers. Daniel sat with a few co-workers he'd known for years. They talked about a new movie, about sports, about everyday things that didn't really matter, but made the hours easier. Someone teased him for always eating the same meal, rice and chicken. He laughed, saying it was cheap and filling. It was all lighthearted, the kind of moment that made work feel less like work. After lunch, Daniel walked back to the main floor, feeling a little heavier but content. The air inside felt warmer now, the afternoon light slanting through the high windows. He took a deep breath and got back to his station. The machine beside him rattled briefly before settling down. The technician from earlier walked past again, carrying his tools, saying something about needing to check another unit later. Daniel nodded without thinking much of it. Everything felt ordinary, maybe too ordinary. The rest of the afternoon moved at its usual pace. The stack of boxes grew taller and his muscles began to ache slightly, a familiar tiredness he'd learned to live with. He glanced at the clock. It was only an hour until the end of the shift. That's when he always started to feel lighter, counting down the minutes, thinking about heading home, showering, and sitting by the window with a cup of tea. That small thought always got him through the last stretch. As the clock ticked closer to 4, Daniel felt the familiar mix of relief and fatigue. The hum of machines, the distant chatter, the smell of tape and cardboard, all of it had become part of his world. Nothing about the day stood out as unusual. It was another shift, another paycheck, another step toward the quiet life he was building for himself. He had no reason to think it would be any different, but sometimes that's how life is. The days that seem the most ordinary hide the biggest turns. Looking back later, he would remember every small detail. The color of the sky, the song on the radio, the sound of the technician's tools against metal. At that moment, though, he was just another worker finishing another long day, unaware that the calm around him was about to break in a way no one expected. And as he reached for one last box, feeling the slight ache in his back and thinking of nothing more than the evening ahead, the world around him remained deceptively still, as if holding its breath, waiting for what came next. The next morning came just like the one before. The city was quiet, the air cool and a little damp from the night's rain. Daniel woke up to the same alarm tone, the same faint light coming through the curtains. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while, feeling that half-awake heaviness before another long day. Nothing about the morning felt unusual, and yet something small sat at the back of his mind, an odd feeling he couldn't explain. As he walked to the bus stop, the streets were glistening with puddles. A few shop owners were sweeping water from their doorsteps. The bus came a few minutes late, which wasn't unusual, but Daniel noticed the driver seemed distracted. He gave a small nod, sat down near the window as always, and let his mind drift. He didn't know why, but he kept thinking about the technician from the day before, the way he had hurried between machines, the faint worry in his voice when he said he'd check something later. It wasn't anything serious, but the memory lingered. When he reached the warehouse, the sky had turned brighter, and the building looked the same as always. Gray walls, metal doors, and the smell of oil and dust. Inside, the noise picked up quickly as more workers arrived. The same greetings, the same jokes, the same buzz of people settling into their stations. Daniel clocked in, tied his gloves, and got to work. His hands moved automatically, but his eyes kept wandering to the machine area, where the technician had worked yesterday. Everything looked fine. Still, that strange feeling stayed with him, quiet but present. As the morning went on, the air inside felt heavier than usual. Maybe it was the weather or just his imagination. The radio played softly, though the sound of the machines drowned most of it out. Daniel noticed one of his co-workers wiping sweat from his forehead, even though it wasn't that warm. The smell of metal was stronger today. He tried to ignore it and focused on sealing boxes. The rhythm of work usually calmed him, but for some reason he couldn't find that ease today. Around 9 a.m., one of the supervisors walked by, checking the floor. He stopped near Daniel's station and asked if everything was running smoothly. Daniel nodded, but mentioned that the conveyor had made a strange sound earlier. The supervisor shrugged and said he'd have someone take a look. It wasn't a big deal. Machines often made noises, but the sound had been sharp, almost like a scrape. The supervisor jotted it down in his notepad and moved on. Daniel went back to work. but his ears stayed alert to every hum and rattle around him. During his short break, Daniel sat outside with a few others. The morning sun had broken through the clouds, and a faint breeze carried the smell of coffee from the break room. His friend across the table was telling a funny story about his neighbor's runaway dog, and everyone laughed. But Daniel found himself glancing back at the warehouse door again and again. "You good?" one of them asked. He nodded quickly. "Yeah, just tired," he said, smiling to cover the unease he couldn't quite explain. When the break ended, he returned inside and the smell of oil hit stronger than before. The technician was back again, crouched near one of the older machines, tightening a bolt. "All good?" Daniel asked casually. The man looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "Yeah, just maintenance. Nothing serious." Daniel nodded, trying to push the thought away. He reminded himself not to overthink things. It was just another workday. But as the hours passed, small things began to stand out. The lights flickered for a brief second around noon. A few coworkers laughed it off, saying it was probably the old wiring acting up again. Then one of the forklifts stalled for a moment before restarting. Little things, nothing alarming, but enough to make everyone a bit more aware. Daniel noticed how quiet the conversations became for a while after that, as if people were waiting for something else to happen. Then just as quickly, things went back to normal again. At lunchtime, Daniel sat in the cafeteria near the back, staring at his food without really tasting it. The room buzzed with chatter, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought about how strange it was that small, ordinary things could feel different, just because your gut told you so. He shook his head and tried to focus on the jokes being shared at the next table. People were laughing again, loud and carefree. It felt good to hear it. For a moment, everything felt normal again, and the worry in his chest eased. When they returned to work, the afternoon light made the warehouse glow faintly through the high windows. Dust floated in the air like glitter. Daniel got back to his pace, fold, seal, stack. The sound of the conveyor moving boxes was steady, and for a while the rhythm felt comforting again. He hummed along with a song on the radio. Maybe he had just imagined the tension earlier. It was probably nothing. Then, near the end of the shift, he noticed something odd. One of the boxes on the line had gotten stuck halfway, causing the belt to slow for a few seconds before jerking forward again. Daniel quickly fixed it and adjusted the weight. It wasn't unusual, but the jerk made the belt vibrate more than usual. He pressed his hand on the side rail and felt a faint trembling. He called out to a coworker nearby to keep an eye on it while he informed the floor lead. The lead nodded and said he'd mention it to the maintenance team. As Daniel walked back to his spot, he caught the technician again, now standing near the control panel, checking readings. Their eyes met briefly, and the man gave a small thumbs up. Though his expression looked more serious than before, Daniel tried not to read too much into it. Machines acted up all the time, it was part of the job. Still, that uneasy feeling came crawling back. The last half hour of the shift dragged on. Everyone was a little tired, moving slower. The hum of the warehouse sounded different to Daniel now, less like a background noise, more like a restless breathing. He tried to shake the thought. He told himself he was just imagining things because of the long hours. He focused on counting boxes one by one until the sound faded into the rhythm again. When the bell finally rang to signal the end of the shift, Daniel felt a wave of relief. He stretched his back, removed his gloves, and wiped the sweat from his neck. Around him, workers were laughing, talking about evening plans and collecting their bags. The technician walked past again, looking thoughtful but calm. "Everything fine now?" Daniel asked as they crossed paths. The man hesitated, then smiled lightly. "Yeah, seems okay for now," he said. "Just keep an eye on that belt tomorrow, all right?" Daniel nodded. Outside, the sun was already beginning to set. The air felt cooler, and a light wind brushed against his face. The same bus came to pick him up, and he sat in his usual spot, watching the world pass by. He felt a strange tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Something about the day had drained him more than usual, though he couldn't point out what exactly. Maybe it was just the long hours, he thought. Maybe he just needed rest. That night, as he sat at his small kitchen table eating dinner, his mind drifted back to work again. He thought of the lights flickering, the belt jerking, the technician's faintly worried eyes. He told himself it was nothing, small problems always got fixed. Still, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that something was different this time. He brushed it off and went to bed early. the steady sound of rain outside his window lulling him to sleep. But deep down, that feeling stayed, soft, but steady, like the echo of a sound you can't quite locate. The kind of feeling that tells you something unseen is shifting, something that will soon break the calm in ways you don't expect. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet warnings were already there, hidden in the hum of machines and the flicker of lights, waiting for the moment they would finally be heard. The morning began quietly again, with the sky covered in a thin layer of gray clouds. The air was cool, and the streets were damp from a light drizzle that had passed during the night. Daniel walked to the bus stop with his jacket zipped up and his thoughts still half asleep. He was trying not to think about work too much, but the image of the conveyor belt from yesterday wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't fear exactly, more like an unfinished thought that kept returning no matter how many times he pushed it away. When the bus arrived, he sat by the window as usual, watching the blurred buildings slide by. Everything looked the same. The bakery at the corner, the school crossing, the tall gray warehouse standing ahead. Routine was comforting to him, but today that comfort felt thinner than usual, like it could break at any moment. Still, he told himself there was no reason to worry. It was just another shift, another day to get through. Inside the warehouse, the morning energy was the same as always. Workers clocked in, machines hummed, and the faint smell of metal filled the air. Daniel greeted a few coworkers, smiled when someone cracked a joke, and headed to his section. The technician was already there, tightening bolts on the control box near the main belt. "Everything good now?" Daniel asked as he slipped on his gloves. The man nodded slowly. "Should be fine. Just had to replace a few parts. Keep an eye out, though." Daniel nodded, trying not to let that last part stick in his head. The first hour went smoothly. The radio played softly in the background, and the rhythmic sound of boxes sliding across the conveyor filled the air. The day felt normal again, and the tension that had sat in his chest started to ease. He found his usual pace, a fold, seal, label stack. It was almost peaceful in its repetition, but every now and then his eyes drifted toward the belt, watching for anything unusual. Around mid-morning, Daniel noticed a faint rattling sound. It wasn't loud, but it was there, a quick vibration like metal shaking against metal. He frowned, leaned closer, and listened. The sound stopped. He looked around. No one else seemed to notice. He told himself it was probably just the boxes shifting and went back to work. A few minutes later, the sound came again, slightly longer this time. He felt his chest tighten a little. He turned to check the belt, and that's when the technician appeared again, adjusting a valve near the motor. "Just making sure it doesn't overheat," the man said. "We're fine." Daniel nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that the man's voice was tighter than before. By 10 a.m., the warehouse was busy. Forklifts beeped as they moved pallets across the floor, and people called out instructions over the noise. The supervisor passed by, clipboard in hand, asking how the new shipment was going. "All smooth," Daniel replied, though his eyes flickered toward the machine again. The hum had changed slightly and deeper, heavier. He decided not to say anything. The technician had already checked it. There was no reason to make a fuss. At break time, Daniel sat on the bench outside with his usual group. The air smelled like rain and engine oil. Everyone was laughing about something one of the guys had said, but Daniel wasn't really listening. He stared at the ground, lost in thought. "You're quiet today," someone said. He looked up and smiled faintly. "Just didn't sleep much," he replied. He didn't want to talk about the machine. It sounded silly, worrying over a few noises. When the bell rang, he stood up, stretched, and went back inside. The light inside the warehouse felt dimmer now, though the skylights above were still bright. Daniel went back to sealing boxes, and for a while everything seemed normal again. But then he felt a small vibration under his feet, faint but noticeable. He froze and looked around. No one else seemed to react. He waited, listening. It stopped. He tried to shake it off, but his pulse had quickened slightly. A coworker beside him asked if he was okay. "Yeah," Daniel said, "just thought I felt something." The other man shrugged, laughing. "Maybe the ground's hungry," he joked, and went back to work. The hours passed slowly. Around noon, the hum of the main belt grew louder again, and Daniel saw the technician talking to the supervisor near the control box. Their faces were serious, and they spoke in low tones. After a few minutes, the technician walked off toward the far corner, toolbox in hand. The supervisor gave a thumbs up to Daniel's section, signaling all was fine. Daniel tried to trust that. Still, a small knot of worry stayed in his stomach. Lunch came and went. Daniel ate quickly and went back to work early, wanting to finish his part before the afternoon rush. The warehouse felt warmer now, the machines giving off heat. The radio played a slow song, and for a while the mood felt calm again. Then around 2 in the afternoon, the rattling sound returned, louder this time. Daniel looked up sharply. The conveyor trembled slightly. "Hey," he called out to his coworker, "did you hear that?" The man nodded, frowning. "Yeah, it's been doing that all morning." They both looked toward the technician's station, but he wasn't there. The sound stopped again after a few seconds, leaving behind a strange silence. Daniel's heart was beating faster now. He didn't like this kind of silence, the kind that feels too still, like everything is holding its breath. He turned back to the boxes, trying to focus. But then there was a sudden jerk, small but sharp enough to make the belt lurch forward. A few boxes slid off the line and hit the floor with a dull thud. Daniel and another worker quickly grabbed them, checking the belt. The machine hummed normally again. "Probably a sensor," the other man said, shrugging. Daniel nodded slowly, but the uneasy feeling in his chest grew stronger. He went to find the supervisor, explaining what had happened. The supervisor sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said, "We'll call maintenance again. Just keep going for now. They'll check it after the shift." Daniel wanted to argue, but didn't. He returned to his station, feeling uneasy. He tried to stay focused, but his mind kept replaying that sudden jolt. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. As the afternoon dragged on, the atmosphere in the warehouse shifted. People were quieter now, more focused, as if everyone sensed the same tension without saying it aloud. The air smelled faintly of heated metal. The radio had been turned off. Daniel's hands moved automatically, but his eyes kept darting to the belt. The hum was uneven now, a low rumble followed by a short pause, then another hum. He thought about telling the technician again, but he couldn't see him anywhere. Maybe he was checking the far end. The clock showed 3:30, only half an hour left. Daniel felt the usual mix of exhaustion and relief creeping in. Just a little longer, he thought. He lifted another box onto the line, sealing it quickly. The sound of the belt vibrated again, louder this time, and then stopped. Completely. The sudden silence made everyone look up. "What happened?" someone asked. Daniel stared at the belt, his breath caught in his throat. The light on the control panel flickered once, then went out. The technician rushed in a moment later, his toolbox clanging against the floor. He knelt by the panel, muttering under his breath as he checked the switches. It's fine," he kept saying, though his tone was anything but calm. The supervisor arrived a second later, shouting for everyone to step back. The workers moved away slowly, uneasy glances passing between them. Daniel stood frozen, watching the technician's hands move quickly over the controls. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the belt started again with a loud clank that echoed through the warehouse. Everyone exhaled at once, a few people even clapping nervously. "See?" the technician said, forcing a smile. "Just a small power glitch." The supervisor nodded and told everyone to finish up their tasks. The laughter returned, a little shaky but real. People went back to work, but Daniel didn't. He stood there, still watching the belt move again, steady and smooth. He wanted to believe it was fine. He wanted to believe the shift would end like all the others. But deep down, he knew the calm wouldn't last. The air still felt heavy, almost charged. And as the final minutes of the shift ticked away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had just been set in motion. Something small but powerful, waiting quietly to reveal itself when no one was ready. The next morning began with the same gray light pushing through Daniel's curtains. He woke up feeling uneasy, his mind replaying yesterday's moment when the belt had stopped and started again with that loud metallic sound. It had been brushed off as a small glitch, but something about it didn't sit right with him. Still, he told himself that if there was a real problem, the maintenance team would have fixed it overnight. He tried to convince himself that today would be normal. Just another shift. On the bus ride, the sky looked heavy, the kind that warned of rain. The streets were quiet, and Daniel sat by the window, his reflection staring back at him. He thought about the weekend again, how nice it would be to finally relax. But even as he planned his time off, his mind drifted back to the warehouse. The sound of the motor, the smell of oil, the uneasy silence that had filled the air before the power came back. He shook the thought away. He was tired of worrying about something that probably didn't matter. When he reached the warehouse, the first thing he noticed was the technician standing near the entrance talking to the supervisor. They both looked serious. Daniel hesitated for a second, then walked in and clocked his card. The atmosphere inside was quieter than usual. A few people spoke in low voices, and some stood near the machine area looking curious. Daniel joined them just as the technician turned around and said, "Everything's good now. Just a safety check. You can all start your work." Relieved murmurs followed, and everyone went back to their stations. Daniel slipped on his gloves and took his place by the conveyor. The hum returned, unsteady, deep, and familiar. He took a breath and started packing boxes again. For a while it felt almost peaceful. The normal rhythm of work returned, and he tried to lose himself in it. The radio was on again, a cheerful tune filling the air. The smell of cardboard and tape surrounded him, and the sound of laughter from a few aisles away softened the tension he'd carried since morning. But around mid-morning, he noticed something strange again. The belt was moving slightly slower than usual, just by a second or two. It wasn't enough for most people to notice, but Daniel had been doing this job long enough to sense when something was off. He leaned over to check the control panel, but everything seemed fine. He kept working, though his eyes flickered to the machine more often than before. A coworker nearby cracked a joke about the endless stream of boxes, and everyone laughed. Daniel forced a smile, though his focus never left the moving belt. A few minutes later, there was a faint clicking sound, 1, 2, 3, then it stopped. His hands paused mid-motion. He looked up, waiting. Nothing happened. He exhaled slowly and went back to work, telling himself he was overthinking it again. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that something wasn't right. During the break, Daniel sat outside under the gray sky with a cup of tea. The breeze carried the scent of wet concrete. One of his coworkers sat beside him, chatting about weekend plans. "You okay?" they asked after a moment. "You seem distracted these days." Daniel smiled weakly. "Just tired," he said, the same answer he'd been giving all week. He didn't want to sound paranoid. He didn't want to be the one always worrying about machines and noises. So he kept it to himself. Back inside, the warehouse lights flickered once as everyone returned to work. Someone groaned jokingly about the electricity bill, and laughter followed. The technician walked past Daniel again, toolbox in hand. Their eyes met briefly, and Daniel thought he saw the same tired look mirrored there, like both of them knew something but didn't say it aloud. The technician gave a small nod and kept walking. By noon, the warehouse was filled with the usual noise again. Machines hummed, forklifts moved, people talked. The routine was back, and for a moment it felt almost normal. Daniel found himself relaxing slightly, even humming along with the radio. Then all at once a sharp crack echoed from somewhere near the far end of the belt. The sound sliced through the noise, making everyone freeze. Heads turned. The belt jerked slightly, then stopped. A few boxes slid off and hit the floor. The technician rushed over, kneeling near the control box. The supervisor followed, shouting for everyone to step back. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. The room felt tense again, the air thick with unease. The technician checked the cables, the switches, the power lights. After a minute, he stood up and said loudly, "It's okay. Just a loose wire. We'll get it running again." People exchanged glances, hesitant but hopeful. Slowly, everyone returned to their workstations while the technician adjusted the wiring. A few minutes later, the machine started again, the hum returning, louder than before. Daniel watched closely, waiting for any sign of trouble. The belt moved steadily, the boxes gliding across without issue. The tension began to ease once more, and soon the warehouse was filled with the sound of work again. The supervisor clapped his hands once and said, "All right, folks, let's finish strong." Laughter returned, and people got back into their rhythm, but Daniel couldn't shake off the feeling. He kept glancing at the control panel, the wires, the motor. Something inside him was uneasy, like he was waiting for another sound, another jolt. The hours moved slowly. Every small creak made him look up. The technician stayed nearby now, monitoring the system closely. They exchanged quick looks from time to time, silent but understanding. Neither said what they were really thinking. By the time the afternoon came, the warehouse had grown warmer. The air was filled with the smell of oil and dust. Sweat formed on everyone's necks and foreheads as they worked. Daniel's shirt stuck to his back, but he kept going. The end of the shift was near, and he just wanted to finish. He thought about how he would go home, shower, maybe order food, and forget all about the warehouse for a night. Then, around 3:30, the sound came again, louder, sharper this time. A metallic clank followed by a grinding noise. The entire belt trembled for a second. "Stop the line," someone shouted. The technician ran forward, but before he could reach the panel, the hum died completely. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Everyone stood still, eyes fixed on the machine. A faint smell of burnt rubber filled the air. The supervisor rushed in again, his voice calm but tense. "Everyone stay clear," he shouted. Workers stepped back slowly, forming a wide circle around the belt. Daniel's pulse raced as he watched the technician kneel by the control box once more. He checked wires, pressed switches, then looked up at the supervisor and shook his head. "Power's down again," he said. "Something's wrong with the motor." For several long minutes, no one moved. The warehouse, once filled with constant sound, now felt eerily silent except for the faint echo of distant footsteps. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know what to do. It was strange how a room that had been so alive could suddenly feel frozen in time. The supervisor began calling people to shut off nearby equipment, one section at a time. Slowly, the noise faded until the entire warehouse stood still. A few workers whispered to each other, their voices low. Someone said it was probably just a short circuit. Another said it could be the old wiring again. Everyone wanted to believe it was something small. But Daniel could see the worry on the technician's face as he stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We'll need to shut everything down for today," he said quietly. The supervisor nodded, though he looked disappointed. "All right," he said, raising his voice, "everyone pack up. Shift's ending early." There was a mix of relief and confusion in the air. People began gathering their things, chatting softly about what might have happened. Some laughed, making light of it. Daniel stayed behind for a moment, staring at the motionless belt. The smell of burnt oil was stronger now. He didn't know why, but it made him uneasy, almost sad. Machines didn't have feelings, but somehow this one felt tired, like it had been trying to warn them for days and had finally given out. Outside, the sky had turned darker, clouds thick with rain. As Daniel walked toward the bus stop, he glanced back once at the warehouse. The lights were dim inside now, only a few workers left near the doors. It looked peaceful from a distance, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But Daniel knew better. Something had shifted. The quiet didn't feel right anymore. It felt like the calm that comes before a storm, the kind that holds its breath before everything changes. He sat on the bus, the rain starting to tap softly against the windows. The city lights blurred into streaks as they passed. He leaned his head against the glass, eyes half closed, thinking of the humming machines, the smell of smoke, and the uneasy silence that followed. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but deep down, he sensed that whatever had been happening inside that warehouse wasn't over yet. Something was coming. And this time, no one would be able to ignore it. The rain had poured all night, tapping softly against Daniel's window. He hadn't slept much. His mind kept replaying the moment the machine had stopped. The smell of burning rubber still stuck in his memory. Something about it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like a warning. He woke up early, long before his alarm rang, sitting on the edge of his bed in the gray morning light. The city outside looked washed out, quiet, almost too calm. He thought about calling in sick. For a few minutes he actually considered it, but that wasn't him. He'd worked through fevers, storms, and sleepless nights before. One bad feeling wouldn't stop him now, so he dressed, pulled on his jacket, and stepped out into the damp morning air. The bus ride was quieter than usual. A few co-workers sat scattered around, some with headphones in, others staring out the window just like him. Nobody said much, but Daniel could feel the same uneasiness in the air, like everyone was thinking about yesterday. When he reached the warehouse, the main doors were still closed. A group of workers stood outside talking in low voices. The supervisor arrived a few minutes later, holding a clipboard and wearing that tight, forced smile he used when something wasn't right, but he didn't want to say it. "Morning, everyone," he began. "We've got the electricians coming in to look at the main belt system. It seems like it's a deeper issue than we thought. So for today, we'll be doing light work, inventory sorting, cleaning. No one goes near the main line until they give the all clear." A wave of quiet relief moved through the group. No one really wanted to go near that machine again. Daniel nodded, grateful for the decision. Inside, the warehouse felt different, almost hollow. Without the steady hum of the conveyor, it felt like a giant empty room. Every footstep echoed off the concrete floor. Daniel joined a small team near the storage racks, sorting boxes and labeling shelves. The work was slower, quieter, almost peaceful compared to the usual noise. But underneath that calm, a strange tension lingered. As the morning went on, Daniel kept glancing toward the far end of the warehouse where the belt stood still. The electricians worked there now. Helmets on, flashlights in hand, wires spread across the floor. He could see them talking to the technician from yesterday, who was pointing at something near the motor. They looked serious. Once in a while, one of them would shake his head and another would take notes. It didn't look like a small problem. Around mid-morning, one of Daniel's co-workers joked softly, "Maybe the old machine finally gave up." Everyone chuckled, but Daniel noticed that even the laughter felt uneasy, like no one really believed their own words. After a moment, the conversation faded again, replaced by the sound of tape and markers. It was strange how quiet could make time move so slowly. Every minute stretched, heavy with thoughts no one said aloud. By lunchtime, the rain had stopped. The air outside was fresh, cool, and full of that earthy smell after a storm. Daniel sat on a wooden crate near the loading dock, sipping tea from a paper cup. He could see the electrician still working inside. The supervisor walked past them, talking on his phone, his face tense. Something about his tone made Daniel sit up straighter. When the supervisor ended the call, he rubbed his temples and walked toward the office without a word. Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. When he went back inside, he passed by the technician, who was crouched beside a panel tightening a bolt. "How's it looking?" Daniel asked carefully. The technician looked up, sighed, and said, "Not good. The motor's worn down in a way I've never seen before. It's like it's been overheating for weeks without showing signs. If it had run a few more hours yesterday, it could have caught fire." Daniel froze. "Fire?" The technician nodded. "Yeah, you were lucky it stopped when it did." That word, lucky, echoed in Daniel's mind for the rest of the day. He kept thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong. One small spark, one missed sound, and everything might have changed. It made him realize how fragile the routine really was. They all trusted those machines like they were invincible, but in truth, they were just as vulnerable as the people running them. The rest of the shift passed slowly. Workers moved around quietly, careful not to disturb the electricians as they continued their checks. The technician stayed with them, offering help when needed. By late afternoon, the supervisor gathered everyone near the center of the floor. "All right, folks," he said, trying to sound upbeat. "The electricians have confirmed that we'll need to replace a few parts. It'll take a couple of days, maybe 3. That means reduced shifts until everything's back up and running. We'll rotate teams for light duties." People nodded, murmuring among themselves. Some were happy to have a few shorter days. Others worried about the pay cut. Daniel just stood there, half listening. His mind was still stuck on what the technician had said. It could have caught fire. He looked toward the silent conveyor belt again. The thought that a simple machine, one they all trusted daily, had been seconds away from turning dangerous sent a cold shiver through him. When the shift ended early, Daniel walked out slowly, his steps echoing on the wet pavement. The air was cool again, the clouds breaking apart to reveal faint sunlight. As he reached the bus stop, he paused and turned back one last time. Through the wide windows of the warehouse, he could still see the faint orange glow of work lights and the silhouettes of people moving around the belt. It looked almost peaceful from afar, but Daniel knew better now. Things weren't always what they seemed. On the bus ride home, the city moved past in blurs of color and light. People got on and off, their faces tired, their minds somewhere else. Daniel stared out the window, lost in thought. He realized how easily everyone had brushed off the warning signs. The slow hum, the clicking, the smell. Maybe they'd all been too used to the routine, too focused on finishing shifts and earning hours to notice when something was quietly going wrong. It wasn't just the machine that had failed. It was the attention everyone had stopped giving it. That night, when Daniel got home, he didn't turn on the TV. He sat by the window instead, watching the lights flicker across the street. The world outside looked calm again, but inside him, something had shifted. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like awareness. He thought about all the little things people overlook every day. The things they think will never matter until suddenly, they do. Machines, relationships, routines, they all need care. They all give warnings before they break. A few days later, the warehouse reopened fully. The new motor had been installed, stronger and safer than before. The supervisor held a quick meeting that morning, thanking everyone for their patience. "We're lucky," he said with a faint smile. "Lucky it happened when it did. Could have been worse." People nodded, agreeing quietly. Then the hum of the machine returned, smoother now, cleaner, steady. It filled the air once more, wrapping the warehouse in its familiar rhythm. Daniel stood at his station, hands on the table, just listening. The sound was different now, not louder or faster, but more alive somehow. He noticed every detail. The rhythm, the vibration under his fingertips, the faint scent of new oil. He looked around and saw others doing the same, their faces a mix of focus and calm. It was like everyone finally realized how much they'd taken this sound for granted. As the day went on, Daniel worked steadily, each movement more mindful than before. He no longer rushed through tasks. He noticed the people around him, the small smiles, the shared jokes, the tired eyes that now looked a little more awake. The warehouse felt the same, yet everything in it had changed a little. The air was lighter, quieter in a good way. When the shift ended, Daniel walked out with the others, the sun finally shining after days of rain. He stopped for a moment and looked back at the warehouse doors, the same ones he'd entered countless times before. But this time there was a strange gratitude in him, for the machine, for the people, for the reminder that even ordinary days can carry quiet lessons. The shift that had started like any other had ended in something deeper than shock. It had ended in awareness. And that, Daniel realized, was what truly changed everything. Sometimes it takes a moment of stillness, a small failure to wake people up. And from that day on, Daniel never walked into the warehouse without first listening, really listening, to the hum that kept everything alive.